topic. Yeah, general framing. And then I'll talk about the specific app ground, the specific net ground that this topic has to offer. And then at the end, I'll have some concluding notes, and then we can have a Q&A session. So with that said, if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat, and I'll try to answer them throughout, or you can ask them at the end. Okay. So yeah, the text of the topic is, in the United States, the benefits of the use of generative artificial intelligence in education outweigh the harms. Okay, so as the topic implies, education is going to be the main ground in this topic. Obviously, the affirmative, the pro, is going to be arguing that in some way, shape, or form, AI, or generative AI specifically, is going to be improving education and changing it for the better. While the next side is going to be saying that the AI is going to harm education. Personally, I think that it's going to get very messy in a lot of rounds where people are just going back and forth about whether it changes education for the better or it changes education for the worse. So I think, as we'll discuss more later, I think a potential strategy that people could be using is reading warrants as to why the effects of AI spill over past education, which obviously gives you a huge advantage in the round because you'll be impacting out to something much greater than just the classroom, right? So in that way, you'll have a much greater advantage in the round, because while your opponents will be stuck talking about how education increases or decreases marginally, you'll be a leg up, right? The second important thing that people should notice about this topic is that it's obviously cost benefit, right? Which means that you're not implementing a policy, you're not fiating in an action, rather you are talking about the general potential benefits of AI and potential negatives of AI. And so in that sense, it will be interesting to see how people argue about like how fiat works. But more specifically, the main concern that all of you should be having is that you don't actually need to argue about the feasibility of AI. You are just arguing about the potential benefits once they fully play out in the classroom, right? So you should have that in mind about what fiat actually means, what you're actually defending when you are debating for the pro, and what you are defending when you're debating for the con. You are not debating the active implementation, but rather the potential benefits versus the potential negatives, the potential cons of AI. The third thing that you should notice is that this is US specific. So obviously you can use examples, you can use empirics from other countries such as China or other countries that have used AI, but your impacts have to at the very least start in the United States. Yes, you can read arguments as to how the impacts of AI spill over into other areas, but you, at the very least, you have to be talking about how it starts in the United States. So the ground that you are defending as the pro, again, is limited to the United States rather than, like broad implementations. Okay. Yeah, so then the final thing, and I think probably the most important thing, because it interacts with a lot of like the ground that we've been talking about, is the idea of being specific to generative AI, right? So there's a couple different types of AI. So AI that generally already exists isn't exactly generative AI, which is AI like ChatGPT, DeepSeek, or other AIs that generate an answer or generate unique inputs, generate unique outputs depending on what you put into it. But rather, there are also general AI programs that people already might be using. So make sure that your evidence delineates between the two, and make sure that you're actually defending the right type of AI, because otherwise the ground or the arguments that you might be going for would be pretty non-unique. Okay. Someone asked, if the topic is based in education, how would the impact spill outside of that? So I think one way that people can articulate that is at the link level. Perhaps AI from education can be spilled over into other areas. Like some industries might model education, or some countries might look at the United States and be like, wait, I would also want to use AI in this area, and then they would implement it in different ways, and that could be a potential route for people to argue that AI spills over. And I think that one reason why people might want to do that is because there's a lot of literature out there for AI bad impact turns, which in this topic can essentially just be read as contentions, right? So there's a lot of evidence that says that AI will outpower or like outsmart the human brain or develop in some sort of like black bots that humans can't control. And in tech rounds, you might want to be using that to your advantage if you can cut a good argument as to how AI is actually able to spill over. Okay. And again, if y'all have more questions, you can just throw them in the chat or I'll answer them at the end. Okay. So another potential ground for this area, for this topic or resolution is going to be structural violence. So a very common argument, one of the first arguments that I thought of when I read this resolution in the beginning was a racism argument. If anyone was here, I think it was 1 or 2 years ago when we were debating biometrics, you would know that there's a lot of literature out there that says that since AI is developed by people and people have inherent biases like racist biases in them, for example, then when you roll out these programs, for example, in schools or education systems, then you're also going to be able to reinforce these racist you're going to be able to reinforce these racist intuitions and just magnify them through large institutions such as education. And that's obviously a direct link into structural violence. So that could be something that people are reading. Okay, so that's mostly the basic background knowledge that all of you should be having in terms of the framing of this topic. Okay, so let's talk about the aft ground or like the specific pro arguments that I think are going to be pretty strong. So like I said, the main pro ground is going to be talking about education and specifically how AI is going to be able to improve education in one way or another. And so I thought that it would be useful to talk about a couple of different ways that this could happen, which could be all read as different links into like some sort of in the classroom improving education sort of impact. So the first link is the very standard argument about how AI can personalize education to a person. So think about when you're using ChatGPT, you're able to ask it specific questions, you're able to ask it to re-explain itself over and over and over again. And so it's able to overall tailor content to the specific needs of people, certain needs of students, and adapt to their learning styles in that sense. And another part is that the AI is able to be constantly adapting, right, to how the student changes in terms of like their learning style. Maybe one day they need some sort of like visual learning, and one day they might need more verbal learning, and the AI can adapt to that. Whereas the teacher, A, doesn't have enough resources, and B, does not have the capability to change their teaching style in that sense. And so the overall impact is going to be improving education, which a lot of these links are going to, because, obviously they're different links into the same argument. Okay, so then the second link that I thought was pretty interesting was education access. And I think that this argument is also very palatable to a lay judge just because it's very simple to understand. So the uniqueness, which is, what's happening right now, is that a lot of people don't have access to education or good learning materials. For example, a lot of students in underprivileged areas might not have access to the best teachers or might not have access to textbooks, etc. But AI inherently equalizes the playing field, right? Because anyone can access ChatGPT. I don't pay for ChatGPT, but I can still access pretty much every single corner of the internet just through a few key searches. So AI is not only cheaper, but more accessible and equalizes the playing field. And in terms of strategy, people will be reading specific arguments that talk about specific scenarios. For example, like race scenarios, like what I was saying before about how certain people in racially underprioritized areas are going to be shunned out without AI. Or people might be reading specific gender arguments about how certain genders are not able to use how certain genders aren't going to be able to access AI in the same way, or how certain disabilities, people with certain disabilities will be able to access these sorts of education materials or learning materials in the same way. And AI will be able to equalize a lot of these inequalities. There's another question. Isn't more of the issue not having internet access, because then people won't be able to access AI anyways? Yeah, so this is sort of the right idea that you should be having, but it's also not necessarily in the ground of the topic, right? Because no matter whether you vote pro or whether you vote con, the idea of AI, the potential pros and cons of AI don't really change internet access, right? So that's just not something that either side can change, and it isn't really in the scope of the topic. I guess you could turn this into some sort of argument as to why, as I guess you could explain this, I guess you could use this to explain certain uniqueness as to why AI doesn't necessarily have all the benefits that people predicted to have, because a lot of the predictions don't account for the fact that a lot of people don't have internet access. So you could spin it in that way. But other than that, I don't think that the lack of internet access is really something that either side fiats in and can change, or either side can, change by itself as an idea. And so people wouldn't really be arguing about that. Yeah, no problem. Okay. But then you can argue that those who have good access probably have a decent school. Yeah, so that's going to be the Ned version of that. But obviously the AF and the pro and the con in that sense will be clashing on that. And and that's sort of what I was alluding to earlier about how these sorts of he says, she says, it improves, doesn't improve sorts of debate get kind of messy. So yeah, and I'll explain that more in a bit. Okay, next link. Yeah, so okay, so next link is teacher burnout. And this argument just follows a similar structure to the one before about how teachers are essentially burning out right now, right? So a lot of the teachers right now, they are really stressed. They don't have enough time. They don't get enough money. They don't get enough benefits. And so they're quitting. And the argument is that AI will inherently ease the burden that teachers have to deal with, because you can grade faster, you can write better lesson plans in less time, you don't have to spend as much time thinking about new lesson plans, thinking about new ways to teach people, or adapting to specific students. All of these things ease work burden and allow teachers to focus or spend more time on themselves and improving as teachers, which means that teachers ultimately decide to stay and improve education, right? So it's all about a trajectory of improvement, which is essentially what the app is defending. Okay, next link, plagiarism. So these arguments, like I've said, all follow in a similar way, except you are constantly shifting the specific benefit that you are isolating to education, right? So the plagiarism argument is just that plagiarism is rising right now, which is definitely bad for education, because you aren't really learning when you're just copy and pasting off of some Wikipedia article, or copy and pasting what ChatGPT or DeepSeek or some other AI wrote down for you. But the argument is that AI will be able to hypothetically check back against plagiarism. For example, through chat. I know there's a AI out there called GPT-0 where they're able to check back against other AIs, or other like artificially written text. And so in this way, you would be able to improve education, because people wouldn't have the incentive, at the very least, to cheat and plagiarize. So again, note how this can also be a perceptual argument, that if students realize that teachers are able to actually catch them plagiarizing, or are able to know when they are just cheating off of ChatGPT, then at the very least, they'll be disincentivized and deterred from cheating in the first place. So this next argument is going to be an example of how AI. Oh, sorry. I'll answer the question first. two questions. How do you respond to something like teachers spend more time going over AI generated content if AI helps teachers, then it creates a situation where they can get paid less? Um, Okay, so for the first part about how teachers spend more time going through AI generated content, I think that the way you respond to this is like a question of relativity. Would you rather be a teacher who needs to come up with entirely new plans, write everything out by hand, or would you rather be a teacher who just needs to go through a few paragraphs of AI generated content, right? I think that the question is I think that the answer is obviously the latter, where you're willing to go over AI generated content because it's much less and it's much less work. Then the second part of your question is saying if AI helps teachers, then it creates a situation where they get paid less. Not necessarily, right? Because the teacher is still doing the teaching part, which is what they're getting paid for. Yes, they're getting help, but that means that they're able to spend the time that they were previously spending just writing out lesson plans, which isn't directly helping the student. They're able to spend that time in other areas, for example, having one-on-one time with the student, which means that they're still able to um, put in the same amount of hours, do the same amount of work. If anything, they're doing more, which means that they would be able to be paid the same amount or more. And then next question, isn't that easily refuted by saying that you can paraphrase ChatGPT's responses? I think that there are new AIs or new versions of GPT-0, for example, that are able to catch on to that because GPT-0 or GPT it writes in certain ways. They come up with ideas in certain ways or have certain indicators that signal to other programs that these ideas were created by ChatGPT. And again, yes, this is a great response to the argument, but I think it's also very frontlineable in a different way. Okay, so let's talk about the next argument about IRL skills, which is like essentially the idea that AI is going to be used in the workforce, right? And insofar as this is true, if students are able to work with AI from the ripe age in school, from like a very young age in school, then obviously they're going to be much better prepared for the future where they are, working with the same programs because it would be able to prepare them from very early on, which is overall key for workplace preparedness, and that's how you improve the economy. There's a ton of arguments as to people will be able to lead less stressful lives. You improve the economy because people are more efficient. You improve business bottom lines because again people are more efficient. And I guess you improve the chances that someone is able to get paid more. All of these are different arguments or different impact scenarios, but notice how all of these arguments are external of, the classroom. They're able to have impacts that are greater than just marginal increases or decreases in educative value, which I think would put you one step further than your opponents who would be stuck talking about impacts that are stuck in the classroom. With that said, let's move on to the con side. If anyone doesn't have questions, and again, you can ask them at the end. Okay. So, like I said, education is the main ground. The NED is arguing that AI is bad for education. So, one way that the NED could articulate this is through an idea of surveillance, right? And so, I think that the argument follows that AI in most cases will just be used to surveil students. And even if it doesn't actually surveil students, students will probably get the perception, at the very least, that they're being watched by their teachers, being watched by the administration through their computers, through AI programs. And that has a couple of detrimental effects. To link back into, the education class that we were talking about, if students know that they're being constantly watched by their teachers or by the administration, then the level of trust and cooperation that they're willing to give greatly decreases. They wouldn't be willing to go to the teacher to ask questions. They wouldn't be willing to go to whoever in order to report problems with the school. And I think that's really bad for education. But then a potential argument that people can read in front of a more techier judge is that this spills over, right? Because think about how developing democracies, for example, those in Europe or in other areas, look at the United States when they see the US rolling out these really essentially surveillance programs to schools, right? They would be able to justify it by saying the United States does it too, and that could spill over. Okay, so let's answer more questions. Actually, there's a bunch of questions, so I'll just note them and answer them at the end. So if you have more questions, just put them in the chat and we'll answer them as I go for now. Okay, so then the next link to this education argument is an argument about over-reliance. So I think the way that the Ned could read this is that there's a fine line between using education and between using AI and over-relying on AI. And although the pro will be saying that we can strike that fine balance, the Ned will be taking a more pragmatic approach and be saying that in the majority of cases, students don't want to learn from AI. They just want AI to do their work for them. And so that's the argument, right? That people will become more reliant on AI. They won't need to ask teachers anything because they can just ask ChatGPT it, and ChatGPT won't take the same amount of time, won't take the amount of attention or critical thinking that a teacher does. And so obviously that's definitionally bad for education because you're not doing any of the critical thinking you need in order to understand concepts, but it's also directly bad for teacher jobs just because of automation, because now you're effectively taking away the role that the teacher has, which is this one-on-one opportunity to teach people certain things, to make them understand certain things, and you're replacing that with just a program. And so that's definitionally bad for their jobs as well. Okay, so then the next argument or the next link into the education argument is an argument about face-to-face connection. So right now, the uniqueness is that face-to-face connections, like the interaction that you'd have between a human teacher and a human student, is inherently important to the education, to the classroom space, right? Because it teaches people how to do social learning. It teaches people how to interact with other people in a socially acceptable way. But AI definitely ruins that because instead of talking to another human, you're now interacting with just a screen that spits out words to you, which is definitely bad for, this social learning that people should be having. And so the ultimate impact is that education goes down, like a lot of these arguments have been. But again, that made sense because the main ground of the topic is going to be talking about education and whether it goes up or down. Okay, so then the next topic, the next argument or the next link is an argument about increased economic inequality. So someone earlier was saying that richer schools would hypothetically be able to afford more cutting edge programs in order to put themselves ahead of, for example, poorer schools who won't be able to buy the most up-to-date versions of ChatGPT, for instance. And I think that's exactly the argument that the Ned will be making, right? They would first be making a claim as to why inequality is already really high. For example, there's a really big difference in, for example, tax brackets or the incomes that people have. So I think that's the first part of the argument. The next part of the argument is that AI will just be the new frontier of this inequality because now you have school programs, like rich programs, that are able to just purchase newer and newer and newer versions of ChatGPT or DeepSeek and be able to be put ahead in so many different ways from poorer programs. And so the ultimate impact is not only are you decreasing education because you have poorer programs that just don't have at the same amount of teaching ability or teaching capability as these larger programs, but you're also directly widening the digital inequality gap between these different programs. Okay, and so I was talking earlier about structural violence, and so this is the argument that links into structural violence the most, in my opinion. So this argument as to racial bias. And so the argument essentially just follows that since AI is developed by humans, it has inherent biases in them, right? So you wouldn't be able to. So when an AI program is launched in a school, now you have data that is being released to students that are built or written from an inherently biased source. And what's adding on to this is that a lot of these programs, a lot of the AI programs that we are talking about, don't exactly have a diversity of people working on them. It might just be one company that hires in a specific way that launches this program to a school that has a specific population of students. But then that program is shared over a bunch of different schools that have different student populations. And there's obviously a very clear scenario as to how that spreads into a bunch of different school systems. And so what the ultimate impact is that you have a scenario where schools are now using AI with Eurocentric perspectives, inherently white-based, very racist perspectives that are being used in nearly every single school system. And that's definitely bad, not only because you are erasing different cultures of knowledge or different wealths of knowledge that are needed for certain people, but you are also teaching students and justifying it that it is okay to be learning from these groups, which is a direct link into structural violence. And so that's the biggest link that people will be reading. Okay, so let's talk about some of the questions. And since I'm no longer presenting new stuff, y'all can just unmute if you want to ask a new question. Okay. So I think I stopped. Oh, was someone going to say something?
Yeah, sorry. I was wondering if you could go back to the last slide that you went on and explain that one.
The racial bias slide.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I don't know if any of you were here to debate the biometrics topic, but essentially the way that a lot of the net arguments on this topic, on that topic, and this topic will work is that AI has an inherent ability to be corrupted, right? The people who are making AI are in many ways going to be able to inject their biases into the program that they are releasing. For example, someone who's creating a new AI program might have specific tendencies or specific biases that they will be able to encode within the AI and then send it off to schools, for example, if it's approved by the government. And so the problem with that is that now you have students who are learning from these biased sources there, and moreover, and yeah, so basically they're learning from these biased sources, and so they essentially learn that it's okay to have these inherent biases. In fact, these biases are now taken as fact because they're getting it from what's supposed to be a credible source. And so the ultimate impact of this is that you have a whole generation of students who are learning from these really biased sources and that no longer consider like not Eurocentric perspectives, because obviously all the information that they're learning is inherently racist and has these biases encoded within them. Okay, so I'm going to start answering questions. If anyone has anything more, they can just unmute. But the resolution doesn't imply that the AI has to be used, right? Like no one's forcing them to use AI, so the app is going to take the benefit of the doubt and say that it will only be used when it's needed by students for tutoring, etc. I think that's potentially a way you can frame it, but I think specifically what the app defends is just a hypothetical world where AI is used in nearly every school system, and the app will have to defend the potential benefits of that world, and the NED will have to defend potential like consequences of that world. So I think that the usage of AI isn't exactly relevant to what the app or the con or the pro, sorry, what the pro or the con will be articulating. Okay. Um. So next question: does surveillance from AI count as generative AI? I don't think that they're necessarily the same. I think that the argument more follows along the lines that when schools roll out generative AI, they'll also use the AI as a form of surveillance itself. So even if surveillance itself isn't a form of AI, it is an effect of generative AI, which is what the con will be able to defend. How can we respond to over reliance on the affirmative? Um, I think that one of the main responses that people will read is that there will be inherent checkbacks against over reliance. Obviously, the school system isn't that stupid, and they'll realize that wait, these students aren't really learning anything. They're just chat GPTing all of the answers, and that's obviously what people have started to do right now. So there's no reason why over reliance is an inevitable fate that we experience when we use AI. How would you respond to something like some help is better than no help on your inequality argument? Um, I don't think that the comparison is necessarily no help to some help. I think the comparison that people are more likely going to make is that it's just a massive setback for underprivileged communities don't essentially have a lot of resources in the first place. And so to have a little bit of help, but then be outmatched by nearly every single person, I think that is an overall net con that the con side is obviously going to be able to defend. Um, can't the idea of racial bias be easily refuted as teachers are also biased? Also, AI models are more diverse. Yes, I think that this is a great response, but I think the response to this is the idea that even if we have biases already, we obviously shouldn't be openly increasing them just because we can, right? So the idea would be we should be able, and I think that what's also at the heart of structural violence framing in the first place is that we have like a moral obligation to decrease inequality in every single instance. And so just because there is already bias doesn't mean we should increase the bias in the first place. Then to address the next part of your argument, which is to say that AI models are already pretty diverse. Um, I don't know if diversity is necessarily the place where we should be looking. I think the idea is more along the lines of think about the people who are in top government positions and are the people who are approving which AIs go through and which AIs don't, and think about the people who are making the AI. Are these people more diverse? Yes, we can have different models of ChatGPT or different models of DeepSeek, but do these models account for the inherent biases that we are experiencing, right? That should be the question that you should be asking if you are trying to defend this argument. For education impacts, how can we terminalize it other than better learning? I think that you can have specific statistics that explain why education is necessarily important. Like, for example, a better education would be able to improve the economy because now you have more educated people in higher positions. A better educated population would be able to obviously solve more problems. For example, they might be able to come up with better solutions to climate change or other existential risks, which should be a way that you articulate this impact on in front of a more techier judge. Are there any contentions with drastic lives impacts? Yes, I think that one potential argument that people could be reading, and it's very similar to the education impact, is an argument about sexual education, right? So obviously, in the wake of everything that's happening right now, especially under the current presidency, a lot of sex education opportunities are going down. So if we're able to have AI programs that actively teach people about sex education and about the things that people need to know in order to lead healthy lives down the line, then having an AI that's able to do that would obviously save people from having diseases like sexually transmitted diseases. And so that could be a direct lives impact. And I also think the reason why this argument could be really beneficial is because it has such great uniqueness. Like, it's obviously just inherently true that sexual education is going down in the status quo. And so all the pro really needs to prove is any risk of solvency as to how AI is net beneficial for increasing access to that education. Um, okay. So then hold on, I lost my spot. Okay. But can't they just say it doesn't matter because it's not the issue of AI, it's the problem of our society? Yes, I think that this is definitely ground that the Ned has access to. The argument that that the pro has access to, that the potential, like that the pro would be defending like the fully optimized utilization of AI, and how that is specifically able to reap all of the benefits that the pro will be talking about. I think that this could be a way that people frame what they're defending on the app. But I also think that the net can articulate the fact that we are debating the most probable implementation of the resolution, right? That we are debating how people are using AI in the status quo and looking at specific empirics as to how people have used it in the past. And I think that this might be one source of clash in the debate, in combination with all of the other clashes about education that we've already talked about. Could someone say we put regulations in place to ensure the AI is not racist? Yes, we definitely can. But the problem is that we've tried to put these regulations down in the past, but obviously that didn't work because think about the people who are putting in the regulations in the first place. And notice how whenever I'm talking about this like racial bias argument, we're like part of the narrative is questioning the people who are implementing or are regulating the AI in the first place. And that's really central to winning this argument, because the net, the entirety of the net, and I think that all of you should be taking a note about this, is that all of the net, the primary narrative of the net is going to be saying, look, the pro side is very idealistic. They are saying that if we are able to use AI in the most optimized way in every single case, we'll have these benefits. But unfortunately, we're not able to do that. This just isn't this isn't possible. We're not living in the utopia. So we should look at the more pragmatic approach, which is why you vote for the net. Because when you look at what's happening today in the real world, what's happening is that AI is just reversing education in nearly every single way, and that would be the way that you articulate a lot of the net. And I think that will be really advantageous whenever people are debating in front of like lay judges, for example. Next question. Can schools make sure to get unbiased AI? Again, unbiased AI, according to the net, will not exist. Every AI has biases because every AI is made by a human at its beginning, right? So all of these different biases that we are talking about will inherently exist, and that will just be part of the net narrative. Are these biases inevitable then? Yes, that's exactly the argument on the con. But obviously, these different regulation responses that people are bringing up will be the way that the pro is able to combat them. And also, if you are on the pro and someone is reading this argument about racial bias, you should be asking yourself, like, what's the comparative, right? Yes, we can say that AI is biased, but what's the alternative? Because is it more harmful to have like biased teachers or a biased program? And so these should be like the different questions that you're asking yourself when, especially when you're facing an argument like this. Some AIs train themselves though, so unless the content is biased, the AI shouldn't be biased. And is it really realistic the programmers are purposefully making their AI biased? Some Yeah, so I think that this is definitely a valid way to handle the argument. But I also think that the way that the Ned would frontline this is that although some AIs train themselves, the reality is that a lot of the programs that we're talking about are made by humans, and of course, in the majority of cases, humans inherently have biases, and so to answer the next part of your question about how like realistic it is, I think it is pretty realistic that we've seen programs in the past that are inherently like really racially motivated. Like, for example, when people were debating the biometrics topic a few years ago, the main argument was that people like police officers, for example, were able to use surveillance in order to track down BLM protests or track down people of color in order to do all sorts of abuses. And so even if the AI itself is itself neutral, the way that it is used to potentially be an avenue for future corruption. And that's part of the net narrative. Won't this yeah, so then the next question. About racial bias, won't the teachers see the type of stuff the students are learning and see how it's racist? Yes, I think the teachers will be, but insofar as the NED is talking about how these programs are going to be rolled out in such a huge array of different like ways, then I think that even if teachers are able to see what's happening, the ability that they have to necessarily see all of it or to even stop it in the first place is pretty minimal. But again, I think that this is a good way to combat the argument. Okay, so then how far into the future is it fair to project our scenarios? What do you exactly mean by that? I think that it depends on the sort of narrative that you want to go for. If you want to go for a more long-term argument, then obviously that should be how you frame your impacts. But if you want to go for a more short-term argument, that you should be looking at then you can be looking at I guess like different studies about how AI is being used right now, since AI has been a pretty recent development in terms of education. And I also don't know how like relevant this is, because the main clash that I see in terms of like the weighing debate that people will have is an argument about like probability, or like how probable it is that AI will benefit or harm certain forms of education. And I think that that is the main form of weighing that people will be using, in addition to whatever scope weighing that people might be reading if they're reading an impact scenario that doesn't only affect the classroom. Is it possible to make the argument that AI integration is inevitable because it's already so present in the scroll? I think that this isn't part of the debate because the argument isn't whether AI is integrated or whether AI is used or not, but rather whether AI itself is net beneficial or net harmful. And so it doesn't really matter if AI like is integrated fully today or it never is, because the Ned will still be saying AI is bad and the pro will still be saying AI is good. But I think that one way that you can use this is to articulate like empirics as to how AI has been good in the status quo when it's used. So if you are winning a claim as to why AI is good right now, then that should give you a access to a whole litany of different empirics as to how AI has been useful in the status quo. Um, is there a way to run a Tron argument that's similar, but is centered more around misogyny and those types of beliefs bleeding into the AI? Definitely. I think that this is part of what I was alluding to earlier about how people will be reading specific disability, gender, and there's even like language arguments as to how AI will be biased in all of these different ways. And I think that this is definitely the right sort of mentality that you should be having when you encounter an argument like racial bias and you want to run it. How would you refute the fact that it would lead to environmental damage and which is worse than non-A? How would how exactly would AI lead to environmental damage? I think that's a bit open-ended. Um, but and I guess like even if you want to go along those lines, I think that the environmental damage that you'd be encountering is like pretty minimal. I also don't know how AI would like lead to environmental damage. Um, does generative AI in education imply that students are inputting prompts, or is it everyone? Um, I th- yeah, the idea is like everyone would be using. Wait, like by everyone, do you mean like everyone in society? Because that's not part of the topic. The topic is more along the lines of whether students are able to use generative AI, and in that sense, I guess it would be like students specifically are inputting prompts. I guess like students and teachers and whoever is like related to education, because that's what we're debating. How to do weighing on arguments like over lines versus personalized learning that are pretty much opposite links. Can we interpret the topic as benefits, harms to education from AI? To answer the second part of your argument, exactly. This is exactly what we are debating, to argue about the potential harms and benefits of AI education. And to answer the first part of your question, how to do weighing on arguments like over lines versus personalized education, I think that, like I was saying, the main way that you should be breaking this clash is on probability, for example, right? You can look, there are a ton of different empirics that I've personally taught before about like how, oh, sorry, as to like how education is, about like how in the past AI education has been beneficial or harmful, and there are a ton of statistics in that area. And what I mean to say is that can we say all impacts should be related to benefiting, harming education? I think that a lot of the impacts that you will be talking about are at the very least related to US education. But again, you can read arguments as to how this spills over in other areas. Like, for example, if you win an argument as to how education increases or decreases, you can then go from there to say this impacts the economy because a more educated population would be more efficient, produce more things, figure out different innovations, and in that way improve the economy. What are the empirics that show AI has been racist in the past? Like I've been alluding to, like there's been examples of how AI biometrics in the past, like things like surveillance cameras, have been racist. And there's also a ton of literature on that area. I personally haven't cut this argument, so I'm not exactly entirely familiar. Um, and so if you do want to look for more empirics, you can look at past topics, or like you can look on different wikis from past years, because this has definitely been a major argument in a ton of different areas. Um, LLM models, which are probable to have much less bias in consequential computer vision. Um, Computer vision is the problem, but that won't really be used in education. Like algorithms that determine if a person is a criminal using skewed data due to incarceration rates of African Americans in the United States. Um, like I guess this is like a way that you can articulate this argument, but again, like the narrative I think refutes this directly as to like questioning the sort of authority of people who are making these decisions in the first place. But again, if I guess like if you're really convinced in all of these different responses that I've been talking about to racial bias, then I don't know if this argument would be like the ideal one for you because there's definitely a ton of other ground about education that people can still go for. Um, Building data centers requires land harms environment. I guess like a lot of the data centers are already built, so I don't exactly know why that's such a big unique harm. And if anything, a lot of the things that the U.S. does like inherently has impacts on the environment, and so the trade off that you're getting is like an entire generation of better like I guess the way the AF would respond to this or like the pro would respond to this is that the trade-off that you are getting is a huge generation of newly educated students that have learned in a much more efficient way. And if anything, I think that the education argument is inherently a prerequisite to this, or at least a short circuit, because probably in most cases a more educated person would be able to figure out better solutions to our environment crisis, for example, and so that could be a way that you're responding to this argument. And I'd also question like the amount of unique harm that you're getting from like AI that is used in education, right? Energy consumption, yeah. So talking I already talked about that kind of thing. So could you refute plagiarism by just saying that GPT-0 has a bad accuracy rate? Also, for the F argument about how teachers need AI to lessen the workload, doesn't that just link in to the net over lines argument? Okay, so to answer your first argument, GPT-0 obviously GPT-0 is just a one-off example I came off, like the top of my head. So there are a ton of other programs that people are using right now. And also I would say that when people realize that you are using AI in such a new way and on such a massive scale, then obviously there's going to be people who are going to invest more and more of their time into creating these anti-AI programs, things like GPT-0 that are just obviously way more efficient. So again, it's sort of a trajectory of improvement argument that the app is defending. So then to answer your next question about like how AI, about how all of the education arguments linked into the net over reliance argument, well, that's obviously definitionally going to be the clash that you have to resolve in every single debate, right? The net is always going to make an argument as to how in some way you are reducing education. And the AF is going to make some argument as to in some way you're going to improve education. So that's always going to be a clash that you're going to have to resolve. But if you want to talk about specifically the net over reliance argument, I think that, again, like I talked about, there are definitely going to be checks that people can argue that would be able to resolve like the over reliance argument. There's going to be a certain way. And yeah, so there's a ton of different responses to the net over reliance argument that you're just going to like read to this argument rather than yeah, so basically what I'm saying is that just because the net is saying that there will be over reliance is not a reason why you should not be reading an argument on the pro as to why education increases. Um would richer schools be able to regulate AI to not have racial bias? Um I guess like I don't know exactly how that would work. I don't exactly know why just like the fact that you have more money necessarily makes the AI that you use like less racist or like what sort of regulations that you'd be talking about. So I think if someone wanted to read this argument against me, for example, in a round, they'd have to be way more specific in that case because just because you have money doesn't necessarily mean that you have like the last slipper to all of like the racial bias arguments that the net will be making. How do what AI education will look like? For instance, one to say AI is not going to be heavily used in classrooms directly, but primarily outside in between, or one to say schools will use them in the classroom, and students will be heavily using them, and schools will. Um, yeah. So I think you answered your question at the end about how whatever is closest to the status quo. This is also this is like essentially what debate is, right? So it's talking about the most likely implementation of the resolution and the way you delineate which form is going to be the most likely implementation of the resolution is to say that looking at what we are doing in the status quo and how that is essentially what we would likely be mimicking in the AF world. In a nutshell, how to go about probability weighing. What's on my mind mainly is, yeah, exactly. You answer your question again about using empirics, looking at the status quo, and using these sorts of arguments to combat these different, and using these like different ways, these empirics to break the clash in a lot of these different ways. On social interaction, can F downplay Ned and say it's not that deep. It's like resources right now, so it's like not much of a difference from screen usage, but it will have more. um, I think that the unique benefit that the app is articulating is that you have the benefit of talking to a screen, right? Like, no, sorry, not the benefit, like the harm of talking to a screen rather than, face to face with another person. So I think that's the specific way that you'd articulate the social interaction argument. Um, okay, so the next question, bridge schools will have the less biased AI, meaning um, not necessarily the less biased AI, just the more updated AI. And so I think that's a question that the Ned should be questioned. That's the question that the Ned should be asking, whether like rich schools will necessarily have access to less biased AI or more updated AI. Just the two obviously are very distinct. I thought this was a value debate, right? So aren't we arguing its harms and goods as of right now, or is it AI used in the future for education? Yeah, so this is also another clash that people will have to resolve in nearly every single debate about whether we are arguing about the potential benefits or the benefits that we see right now. So I think one way that the app could define the like what they're defending or like define their ground is to say that we are talking about all of the potential benefits, like the benefits that we get in the most ideal world versus the cons that we see right now, and that can go back and forth. To the net argue that AI companies are going out of business, so it wouldn't continue to improve. Um, AI companies are going out of business. So, what do you mean by that? I think the way that you'd respond to this is just by articulating the reason as to like why AI as an idea, AI as like as it's like potential uses as to how those play out, right? So it doesn't matter if AI right now is not necessarily the best. You're arguing about the potential benefits versus the potential harms. Okay, so does anyone have more questions? I know that I sort of rushed through some questions in the middle, so if you have more, then you can unmute or throw more questions in the chat. Okay, um, there wouldn't be potential benefits because they might just stop improving AI. Well, like first, I don't necessarily know that's true. Like, I don't think that anytime soon we're just going to see a massive collapse in the AI business. And I also think that no one would want to bring up that argument because it would nuke both sides, right? If AI just inevitably collapses, then the con can't say that there's any harms to AI, and the pro can't say that there are any benefits to AI because there is no AI to debate about. And so I don't think anyone would be bringing up that particular argument just because it would nuke both sides' offense. Okay, where does AI and misinformation fall into this debate? That's obviously going to be a major con argument as to how AI could be spreading misinformation or spreading inaccurate information to students, and how specifically that would be bad. Um, and how specifically that would be bad for the next generation of people. Do you think even if arguments contradict ourselves, should we make them more for more rebuttals? No, you should never be making contradictory arguments, especially not in front of a parent or a lay judge, because it just looks incredibly perceptually bad. Because what it says to the lay judge is that you don't know what you're talking about. You are just reading off of information that someone wrote for you, and you don't know how they interact with each other. Um, yeah, so you should never be making contradictory arguments. Could you make this an AF argument by saying we'd increase funding and data sets so that it wouldn't be inaccurate? I don't think that this is necessarily AF offense. Like, I don't think this is a reason to vote for the AF, or I think that this is rather a reason not to vote for the con, because this could be a piece of defense that you read to the racial bias argument on the net. And even if, or yeah, I guess like there's not enough data. Even if arguments, huh? Even if arguments, as in ever, if there are, I think what you're trying to say is like if one of the arguments is true, then you still win. I guess like in a technical sense, this is true. Like if you're making contradictory arguments, then at least one of them is true. So you should still flow the one true argument through. But I'm saying like in the majority of cases, especially on this topic where a lot of tournaments are pretty lay skewed, you shouldn't be making contradictory arguments. What's your top AF art, top net art? I would probably read some sort of version of the education argument with an assortment of the different links that I articulated throughout this presentation. And on the net, I'd probably do something along the lines of like the racial bias argument or something along like education as well with some of the different links. I think the surveillance link is pretty persuasive because I think it's like really realistic and it's pretty understandable and really easy to explain. How do we stop this from being a back and forth debate of AF is wrong or net is wrong and make the debate more clear? Sorry if that. No, no problem. I think that again, the way to delineate the clash is just going to be relying a lot on empirics, looking at what's happened in the past, what's happening right now, and using that to your advantage. Any big tournaments coming up to check open taste list for. I know there, yeah, so there's probably CFL state qualifiers, but that's in the future. As of right now, I know Texas had their districts, and I think like some teams, like I think Bel Air disclosed some arguments, but I don't think any straight teams or any like big Texas teams actually did disclose. So I would just look out for that. What do you think about a med argument that Gen AI is used in medical schools, which can improve healthcare? Yes, I think that this is definitely reasonable given like the ground that the app has access to. And I think if you did want to read the argument, you would just read something similar to the different education arguments. Um, the different education arguments we already talked about, just like specific to medical school. And then you'd obviously have to change your impact to be specific to medical education. Anything that has already happened, yeah. So Texas qualifiers, and I think Bel Air. I can type it out in the chat if you want. I think they disclosed Bel. Okay, cool. So I think we're out of time. If there anyone has last minute questions, I can still answer them. But either way, I think that this topic is going to be super interesting. I won't lie that initially I thought that this topic was essentially just a recycled middle school topic, but after doing some research for this presentation and research for my own team, I thought that this topic has a lot of interesting ground, a lot of potential for different interactions. Yeah, so I think this topic will be super interesting, and I wish good luck to all of you who are debating. One last question. Can you respond to overdependence in the past with your calculators, which is what is happening? Like, I think this is like a good rhetorical argument, but I think that there's obviously big delineations that people will argue between AI and calculators. Like, obviously, AI has the potential. AI is not just a calculator, but with words. AI has the potential to create new like lines of thought, which is like obviously why it's called artificial intelligence. This one has the ability to rival humans in the sense that it's able to like critically think artificially. And so I think that this comparison that you're trying to make doesn't like logically make sense, but I think like it could definitely be like a one liner that you throw at the top of the back half speeches. Yeah, so thank you everyone who came. Oh, then what else can we argue for that? I think that this calculator like analogy still makes sense. But I guess I would be asked, I would go along the lines of like the pragmatic narrative that I was talking about like how the app is super utopian, super idealistic. But when you look at more pragmatic approaches, when you look at like more pragmatic approaches, this is like what's happening. Final question, and then we can end. If AI thinking artificially, it arguing back explaining that AI is a reflection of data, so it's nothing new. Well, again, we're arguing about education, so it's about how you're able to teach information to students. So even if you're not creating new information, it's the way that you teach students, which is specifically what's at stake here, like what we're talking about in the debate. And so Yeah, I think that this argument about how it's like nothing new is just a critique about AI in general, and not necessarily specific to like what we're arguing. Okay, so thank you to everyone who came. I hope all of you learned a lot, and I wish all of you the luck for whatever tournaments you're debating for this topic.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.